We're on lesson number 5. If you want to turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 5, that's where we'll be tonight. And the title of our lesson is God in whose hand is your breath. So we'll dive into what we can learn here in Daniel chapter 5. Before we get started, let's go to God. Dear God and Father, we are humbled and thankful that we can gather together here as your children in your presence. We realize, Lord, the great and awesome power that you have. We realize, Lord, that you are the ruler of earth and all nations, and that you have the power to give and the power to take away. We are in reverence and awe of your great might, and we realize, Lord, the great plan that you had through the ages and the prophecies and the many things that have pointed to Jesus and the realization of Jesus in your word and in our lives. We're thankful, Lord, that through your grace and your mercy that you've extended this great salvation to us. We realize, Lord, that we're sinners, that we're in need of your forgiveness. And we just pray, Lord, that you would look down upon us in tender mercy and forgive us of our sins. We're thankful, Lord, for all the blessings that you've given us, and we realize that we are just stewards of the things you've provided, and we just pray, Lord, that you would help us to use these things in a way that glorifies your name. We're thankful, Lord, for this congregation and every member that makes it up, and we just pray, Lord, that we will be built up and strengthened here this evening, and that through the classes, teachers, and the study of your word, that there will be fruit that will be brought forth. And we just pray, Lord, that you would help us all to grow this evening. We're thankful, Lord, for all that you've done, and it's in your Son's name, Jesus. Amen. Okay, you read from Daniel chapter 4 and you go right into chapter 5, and it doesn't really jump out at you, but there's about 20 years difference between Daniel chapter 4 and Daniel chapter 5. So we can see very quickly that Daniel's getting pretty old. We go back to Daniel chapter 1. He was a youth when he was brought into Babylon from Jerusalem, and it's estimated that he was probably 70 to 80 years old at this point in time. So here he's an old man, and so he's had many good years in the service of Nebuchadnezzar and serving in the Babylonian kingdom, and has been that good example and has really been the light or the influence of God in that nation. In our material here, there's some background information that I think is very helpful to give us kind of a feel for, kind of what happened in these 20 years between Daniel chapter 4 and Daniel chapter 5. And, we read about Nebuchadnezzar, and then, boom, we jump into Daniel chapter 5 and we start reading about Cyrus towards the end of the chapter. So what happened in between that time? I guess you might say that period of time for Babylon was tumultuous. It was, you had coups, you had assassinations, you had all kinds of turmoil within the kingdom and the leadership. And really, as the material says here, the bottom line is, during this period of time, the things that were happening in Babylon started to unravel pretty quick. And so we end up here in Daniel chapter 5 with King Belshazzar. I used to read this chapter, and I always got Belteshazzar and Belshazzar mixed up. But Belteshazzar is Daniel. Belteshazzar is his Babylonian name. And but that is Daniel. This is King Belshazzar. And he was the son of this man that's named in our material here, Nabonidus. And so we read about that. But I've always found it fascinating here in Daniel chapter 5, and we'll start reading. Here all the people are gathered, the who's who, the elite of their society are all gathered for this feast, and they see the Syrian or the Persian army right at their doorstep. We're safe. Nobody's ever breached these walls. We got 20 years worth of food in here. Nobody can conquer this place, and here they are having a party, and in honor of their gods. And so history would have it that the way that Babylon fell was the Persian army actually diverted the Euphrates River into a marsh, and the Persian army marched right into the city through that riverbed of the Euphrates. So the Euphrates River basically ran right through the city, and they just diverted the water and went right into the city from the riverbed. And so things happened very quickly. And so in the last bullet point here, there's a number of passages and prophecies that talk about the fall of Babylon. We're not going to read those, but I would encourage you to read them. If you read them, you might find it interesting how brutal and terrible the destruction was for Babylon. I mean, we're talking men, women, children killed. I mean, this wasn't just the Persian army marched in and just kind of occupied the city. They went in, it was brutal. And these passages here in Isaiah and Jeremiah really kind of give us a feel for what that looks like. And it was terrible destruction. And they give us these glimpses of what's going to happen in the future. And, just thinking about this history for just a moment, what can we learn from it? You've heard the expression, if you don't learn from history, you're apt to repeat it, right? What can we learn from this history, which really confirms what the Bible has talked about?
The danger of being overconfident.
Yeah. Right. What else? Yep, Craig.
Well, despite what man thinks and what his plans are, as James points out to us, we need to give ourselves to what God's plans are and be ready to accept those, understanding that He rules different things are going to happen.
Right. Others? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, yeah. All very good points, and perhaps the biggest thing that I take away is God's in charge. It's not, who did we elect, who's the president, who's the emperor, who's the king. That doesn't matter. God's in charge of nations. He's the one that instituted the home, He's instituted nations, and He instituted the church. He's in charge. And so we learn very quickly, from this example that to the point we don't want to be overconfident and think and put our trust in this country, right? Our trust should be in God, not people who are ruling this country. So that's kind of, I think, some of the key takeaways. We've read this before, but in Psalms it says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach among any people. And so we need to take heed to that, because we see a very real example of that right here in Daniel chapter 5. The other thing I wanted to kind of point us back to and get in our minds for a little bit, in Daniel chapter 2, he prophesied or interpreted this vision, this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of this image. You remember the head of gold and the bronze, and he kind of went down through this body and equated it to kingdoms. And who was the head of gold? Nebuchadnezzar. That's what he said. And so we see Daniel living in a time where this very prophecy that he talked about comes true here in Daniel chapter 5. This head of gold gives way to this next kingdom. So think about that as we're reading through this a little bit. But let's go back to Daniel chapter 5, and let's read these first 4 verses here. It says, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he had tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king, his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple in the house of the God in Jerusalem. And the king and the lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So as we think about this example, why was this a situation here where they drank of these vessels so serious? What was the problem here? Yeah, Craig.
Well, here they're having a feast to the gods of Babylon to try to protect them from the impending doom they know is there, and they're just basically trying to spitting in the face of the God of Israel, who's in control of all things.
Right. So if idolatry and arrogance wasn't enough, what did they just go and do to add to it? Yeah, Dwight.
These was items that was used in the temple in the worshiping of God, the God. And they have taken these items that was used in the worship of God and used them as common stuff.
Right.
And didn't recognize God for who He was.
Right. Right. I think that's the key point. Just a total disrespect for God and who He was. I mean, you had the idols and the pride, and then you throw on top of it this abuse of God's things, right? His possessions. And, perhaps that may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Just to give us a feel for, because I read, okay, there's some gold, there's some silver bowls and cups and things of that nature. If you go back to Ezra, chapter 1, in verse 7 through 11, this is the time when Cyrus, king of Persia, was allowing Jews to return back to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the temple, and so he provided these things. But these are the kind of things that they took out of the temple. And it gives us a very specific detail of these items. So if we look at chapter 1, verse 7, it says, Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithridates, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar and the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels of gold and silver were 5,400. I mean, what does that kind of leave you in terms of an impression? I mean, it wasn't just a few bowls and cups. This was quite a haul. This was quite a stash. And, there was quite a bit here. But these were the things that are described here in Daniel chapter 5 that were used in partaking of activities in honor of their gods, little g. So, all right, let's. Any other comments or questions on that? Yeah, Captain, go ahead.
Well, first, the thing, obviously, it was very disrespectful, and I know that is part of it, because they did not honor the true God. But I did read something interesting, that they were so superstitious that generally they would always respect everybody's God. They didn't want to. They were fearful of anybody's God, and they would even set up temples for, the captures and their items like that. And this was way beyond what I thought would be normal. Apparently wasn't normal when it comes to things like this.
Right, right. You know, no matter what logic they used to justify their use of this, how did God see it? Completely different, right? So, you know, so to Kevin's point, there may be other, you know, customs or history here, but it certainly wasn't something God approved of. So here they are in this feast. They're having this great party. They're eating, they're drinking, they're being merry, and then we hit in verse 5. It says, "Immediately the finger of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, and the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, 'Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, shall be the third ruler in the kingdom.' And then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing on the wall, which made known to the king's interpretation. The king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed." I mean, can you imagine Belshazzar sitting there, everybody's having a great time, and you see this hand writing on the wall? I mean, wouldn't you like to be there and just see it? I mean, he sobered up pretty quick, didn't he? And, you know, if we think about, you know, the description here, his knees knocked. I mean, this was a shocking experience. To see something like that would make quite an impression. And he couldn't read it. And why was that? It was in Hebrew. The words, and we'll get to those later, but they didn't know Hebrew. Daniel did. And so let's keep reading. And it says, "The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, 'O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods,'" catch that? Let's talk about Daniel. The holy gods. I still don't get it, right? "In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him the chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers because of an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." And, you know, I don't know if you've looked at this before, but it says that Daniel was able to explain riddles, solve problems. The whole idea there, if you look at the Hebrew word, was to untie knots. I don't know if you've ever been fishing with an open cast fishing pole and you had a backlash, like really bad, and you have to try to unravel that thing. And I've had some so bad, I just take out my pocket knife and just start cutting and pulling stuff, and I end up with, you know, a third of the line in there. But Daniel was able to untie knots. He was able to figure this stuff out. He was able to unravel these things. He had the ability to solve problems and explain these riddles. And it goes on to say, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and enchanters have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing, make known to me its interpretation. You shall be clothed with purple, and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known its interpretation. So as we think about this section here, obviously Daniel is able to answer and solve this problem. But the question here is, what does this tell us about Daniel there in verse 17? What do we learn about Daniel? What's his motive? I mean, here he is, an old man, but here's Daniel being a good example. But what's motivating him? Yeah. Okay. I mean, he's got yet another opportunity to glorify God, right? What's not motivating him? Money, the rewards, what else? Popularity. I mean, you can have a third of the kingdom, right? And those are things that he is just not interested in. And these gifts, are not something that he's not doing this for pay. He's not doing this for reward. So there's some other motive, right? But he's still willing to interpret this dream because he knows what's going to happen. And so this, again, another opportunity for God to come to the forefront in this kingdom and for him to tell the story. So, Daniel is that light. He is that salt of the earth that we read about in Matthew chapter 5. And here we see him doing that very thing. Let's keep reading here. It says, O King, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he killed, and whom he kept alive. Whom he raised up, and whom he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with that of wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whomever he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of this house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drank the wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. So, if we think about this a little bit, what would it have meant for Belteshazzar to have humbled his heart? What would that have looked like here? Verse 22. We see what it doesn't look like, but what would it have looked like? Yes, Don. Okay. Go ahead. Was that Kevin?
Restrain himself and even the thought of using that stuff as something.
Okay. All right. Bill, did you have your hand up?
I just go, he wouldn't use that stuff at all.
Okay. I mean, in chapter 4, we just go over the next chapter, right? What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? There was this dream, there was this interpretation of this dream. And, I mean, this sounds very similar. But in chapter 4 and verse 28, it says, All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of his royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence, and for the glory of my majesty? And he wasn't even through speaking, and all of a sudden he was put out to pasture, so to speak, right? And so we find out later that he was humble. And what did he say? He acknowledged God Most High, right? And gave him praise and glory. And that's what Belshazzar should have done. That's what it should have looked like. He should have had more respect for God. He should have learned those lessons from his father Nebuchadnezzar, but he didn't. And, was God going to throw him out in the field for him to learn the lesson? Didn't need to. He should have already learned it, right? It was already there from his father. And so he forgot that lesson. And here he is full of pride and arrogance, and leads him into this disrespecting of God's precious vessels here, and using them in honor of his gods. And so that's, so we can kind of see what humility and pride look like in comparison to each other between chapter 4 and chapter 5. We kind of get that feel. So in verse 23, Daniel starts referencing these Babylonian idols. And certainly, if you go and read Isaiah 46, Isaiah talks about the foolishness of devoting yourself to something that's made out of materials of earth, right? And so, how would you summarize his critique here, Daniel's critique of what happened? What do you think? If you had to summarize this, what would you say? Yep, Craig.
Well, in essence, he tells them he ought to be ashamed of himself. He's committed blasphemy here before God in what he's done. And it's kind of foolishness that he's honoring these gods that man has made.
Right. You should know better that these things that you're worshiping are just dead. They're not living. They're not breathing. They're just materials. They're just objects. They don't know. They don't see. They're just there. And here you are worshiping them. Jason, go ahead.
And as you said, it points out, look, you knew all these things, right? You knew what happened with Nebuchadnezzar before, and yet you refused to learn the lesson. Even your own wife, right, tells you all these things about history that came. So it's not like it's a big secret. It's not even just him. It's all people around him also had a clue. And yet they all together decided to ignore the lesson that clearly was performed.
Right. But who took the lead?
He called this stuff out, yeah.
I mean, if you're in that audience, what are you going to do when the king takes this kind of action, right? So you had a lot of people participating in this. And the responsibility laid at whose doorstep? Belshazzar's, right. See, I told you I'd get them mixed up. Okay, so we read this expression, this phrase here. It says, in God in whose hand is your breath. What does this phrase mean? What is he talking about here? What do we get out of that? Go ahead, Tom.
It allows you to live.
Okay.
You breathe because you will.
Okay. That's true.
That's
Okay. All right. So who's in control of life? God is. Who has the power over life and death? God does. And we get really a good sense of that here in some of these passages that are provided. If you go back over to Job chapter 12 and verse 10. He says, in his hand is the life of everything, and the breath of all mankind. That's pretty sobering to think about, right? We'd like to think that we're in charge of our own life and that we have some power, right? How much do we have? Zippo. We don't control what happens. We'd like to think we're in control of things, but God is. He holds our breath in His very hand. And over in Psalm, let's read that as well. Psalm 104, verse 29. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. So, again, another kind of sobering thought when we think about, the power that God has in His very hand. I mean, He was the creator of all things. And, I am reminded of this example that is listed here in Acts chapter 17. You remember Paul going into Athens, what did he see all around him? It wasn't just a couple of idols. He walked into the city and said, this place is full of idols. And they were all over the place. And I remember one time, Joni and I, we took a trip to Greece when we lived in Europe, and traditionally stood on the spot that they thought was Mars Hill, where you just stand there and look out, and you can just imagine all these idols all over the place, because they had little stands and they were still there. No idols, but all over the place. Right in front of the Parthenon. And you can just kind of imagine what Paul might have been able to see and how he might have reacted. But let's go down, as he's trying to preach the gospel, he brings to their mind this unknown God, this true God that he wants them to understand. In verse 24, in verse 24 it says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is He served by man's human hands, as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of all the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they may feel their way towards Him and find Him. Yet He is not far from each one of us. In Him we live and move and have our being. So when we look around us and we see the great creation that God's provided, and we look in our homes and we see all the things that we have, and when we get up in the morning and we see that we have a healthy body, or that we're living and things are pretty well, what should that do? It's a reminder, right? I mean, it should lead us to believe that there's somebody else that's in charge of our lives. And we should want to seek that God. And that's just one true and living God. And that was the message here. In Him we live and move and have our being. And so going back to Daniel chapter 5, when he talks about the God in whose hand is your breath, I mean, when Belshazzar woke up every day, what should he have been reminded of? Right. Everyone has that opportunity today, right? It's there. And the ability to seek God is there, if we want to look for it. Yeah.
When were you reading that?
Acts 17, verse 24 through 28. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts on that? Make sense? All right. Let's go ahead and keep reading. back into Daniel chapter 5, verse 24. It says, "Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed." And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. These are the inscription of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So we read about this inscription that's on the wall. Daniel interprets it. He says that your days are numbered. Ours are too, right? We're not going to live forever. There's only so much time we have. And but in this inscription, time was up for Belshazzar. This was it. The Babylonian kingdom was not going to be any longer. As Jeremiah 54 verse 64 says, and he prophesied that Babylon would sink like a rock to the bottom of the river, to rise no more. That's it. No more Babylon. So he talks about Tekel. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. When we think about that, what should we learn from that? Weighed in the balances. Yep.
So one of the first things I think about that is the idea again of justice, of being judged. God basically said, "I've passed my judgment. I've weighed you, and I've figured out that my judgment on you is coming, and it's coming down."
Right. So on the one side of the scale, you have pride. On the other side, you have humility. Right? Where did he land? Over here, right? And it was out of balance. It was not level. And you just take this example here. On the one hand, you got disrespect for God and His sacred things. On this other hand, you got reverence and awe. Again, this balance was tipped. You got serving gods over here. And you got serving the one true God over here. Went that way again, right? So we could go on and on, but I think we get the idea here that, to the point, this is a picture of judgment. As a matter of fact, that's one of the images that you see on a lot of buildings and judicial systems, right? You see this balance. Wonder where that came from. And so it's the same idea. It's about justice, and what was about to happen was judgment. I saw some hands here. Yeah, correct. Go ahead.
Well, the idea of the scale, the way that used to work in some aspects was they had a standard that was put in one side, and then you put your things on the other side to see if the balance is changing. So, with God as the standard and what He is expecting out of man, especially men with power, because that's been evident with Nebuchadnezzar and others, He's not measuring up. Where we see the idea of being lacking, and He can't get up to what needs to be, based on all the things you were saying, what He's throwing in things here.
Right. Very good. I like that. That's good. Other thoughts or comments? I thought I saw some other hands. Let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, and try to make application of this to ourselves. I mean, when we think about ourselves, this whole idea of justice and judgment and this balance, I think kind of gets into this idea that Paul is laying out here in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. It says, "Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves, or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test. Can you see how that kind of fits into this whole idea of the scale? I mean, we don't want to wait till judgment. We got to start doing something now, right? We need to look at how do we compare to, as Craig put it, God's standard, right? How are we matched up to that? Are we out of balance? Is there something that we need to do to get back in balance? To get back level with what God expects? So on the one hand, you have God's expectations, and then on the other hand, you have how we've actually performed against those expectations, right? So we have to examine ourselves. We have to test ourselves. We've got to make sure that, our faith is where it needs to be. And it matches this standard that God has laid out in describing the kind of faith we need. Other thoughts, comments? So, this closing thought here, I think, really kind of gets at, a huge application for us over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1 through 3. It says, "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brother, you have no need to have anything written for you, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape." So when we think about what happened to Belshazzar here in Daniel chapter 5, it's really a glimpse or a picture of what's going to happen when the Lord comes again. What are people going to be doing? They're going to be surprised. Well, I didn't expect this to happen. And what are people going to be doing? Carrying about their normal daily business, right? And, in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus was asked three questions, or to respond to three questions. And one of those questions was, what is the sign of the close of this age? And then in verse 36, he really kind of gets at this. He says, "But concerning the day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as it were in the days of Noah, so it will be for the coming of the Son of Man. For those in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So it will be the coming of the Son of God, the Son of Man." So, these passages really describe, what are things going to be like when the Lord comes again? People are just going to be living it up, like nothing ever happened. What do we find Belshazzar doing there? Right when he knew that the Persian army was right on his doorstep. We can't be beaten. We got 20 years of food here. Nothing will ever happen to us. People think that too today, right? Well, he hasn't come yet. Where's the promise of his coming? Going back to 2 Peter chapter 3. There's scoffers and mockers, and there's people that, they don't believe that there's going to be a return. But we have a description here of what it's going to be like, and there's going to be a lot of people surprised. So what's kind of the key lesson that we need to learn from that? We don't want to be surprised, right? We need to be ready. We need to realize that this isn't it. There's something more valuable and more important than life here on planet Earth. So any last thoughts or comments before we close out? Yes?
It's strange that we went ahead and gave Daniel all that stuff.
Daniel wasn't looking for it, right? And he gives it to him. And Daniel just let him give it to him because he knew what was going to happen, right? It was going to be worthless in like about a few nanoseconds, right? Other comments or thoughts? Okay, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Next week's lesson's out there on the podium. If you don't have that, please be sure to get one.